If you've ever felt a strange pressure to appear more financially secure, then you actually feel you're not alone. Maybe it shows up in small ways. Picking the restaurant you can't comfortably afford because you don't want to seem limited. Keeping the nicer phone a little longer than makes sense because it signals that you're doing fine. Saying, "It's all good" when the bill arrives, even when your body quietly tightens. On the surface, these moments can look like ordinary social behavior, but underneath them is often something much more intimate, because trying to look financially secure is rarely just about money. It is often about emotional survival. For many people, the appearance of financial stability becomes a kind of psychological shelter. Not real shelter, of course. Symbolic shelter. A way of protecting yourself from judgment, exclusion, pity, or shame. It becomes a performance of safety. A visible signal that says, "I'm okay. I belong here. I am not failing. I am not at risk." And sometimes that performance becomes exhausting. What makes this especially painful is that the behavior can feel rational in the moment. Human beings are social creatures. We are wired to track status acceptance and threat. Our nervous systems are constantly scanning for cues about where we stand in relation to other people. Money in modern life has become one of the loudest cues. It does not only buy things. It communicates competence, control, desirability, adulthood, and worth. So when you spend to maintain an image of financial ease, your brain may not interpret that as vanity. It may interpret it as protection. That distinction matters, because when a behavior is tied to protection, it becomes much harder to judge clearly. You are no longer deciding only whether an object is worth the price. You are also often unconsciously deciding whether the emotional cost of not buying it feels too high, whether the anxiety of looking left behind is more intolerable than the financial cost itself, whether the fear of seeming unstable feels more dangerous than the loss in your bank account. This is where the emotional cost begins. The first cost is internal fragmentation. A split between what is true and what must be displayed. When you are constantly managing how secure you appear, part of your energy goes toward maintaining coherence in the eyes of others. That takes effort. It requires monitoring, adjusting, presenting. And over time, this can create a quiet but persistent fatigue. Not because you are weak, but because self-presentation is metabolically expensive. The brain treats social evaluation as important, sometimes as urgent. Stress doesn't just tire the body, it narrows the self. And when the self narrows, appearance can begin to matter more than experience. This is why people can buy things they do not even enjoy very much, as long as those things preserve a certain image. The purchase is not always about pleasure. Sometimes it is about avoiding a collapse in identity, about preserving a version of yourself that feels socially acceptable. Behavioral science has long shown that human decisions are not purely rational calculations. They are shaped by emotion, by perceived threat, by the desire to reduce discomfort quickly. And status-related consumption often works in exactly this way. It offers immediate emotional regulation, not peace. Regulation. That distinction matters too, because regulation is temporary. It lowers tension for a moment. It helps you escape the feeling of being exposed, diminished, or less than. But once the moment passes, the underlying insecurity often returns, sometimes stronger than before. Now there is the original fear, plus the aftertaste of strain. You looked stable, but you may feel less stable afterward. This is one of the most painful paradoxes in money psychology. The behaviors people use to signal safety can quietly deepen their sense of unsafety. And the brain learns from this loop, not necessarily wisely, but efficiently. If looking financially secure reduces social discomfort, in the short term, your nervous system remembers that. It builds an association. New clothes before an event, a more expensive choice, in a group setting a curated lifestyle online, a reluctance to say no. These become not just behaviors, but coping patterns. The reward is not the item itself. The reward is temporary relief from threat. Dopamine plays a role here, not simply as the chemical of pleasure, but of anticipation and motivational pull. The brain begins to expect relief through the act of acquiring, displaying, or keeping up. But cortisol often sits in the background, because underneath the polished image is vigilance. You must keep it going. Maintain the signal. Protect the impression. And that can create a chronic low-grade tension that many people never name clearly. They do not think I am performing financial safety because vulnerability feels dangerous. They think I just need to stay on top of things, or I don't want people to worry, or I should be at this stage by now. Yet beneath these thoughts is often a simpler emotional truth. You want to feel safe in the eyes of other people, and perhaps in your own eyes too. That second part is important, because the audience is not always external. Sometimes the pressure to look financially secure comes from an internalized observer, a voice shaped by family, culture, class, and memory. A voice that says being visibly constrained means being irresponsible, that needing help means you have failed, that struggling financially is not just difficult, but humiliating. So the image is maintained not only for others, but against shame. And shame is one of the most expensive emotions a person can organize their life around. To understand where this begins, you often have to go further back than income debt or consumer habits. You have to look at the emotional history attached to money. For some people, childhood made money feel unstable long before adulthood ever asked them to manage it. Maybe there was conflict around bills. Maybe one parent spent to create the illusion that everything was fine, while fear moved silently through the house. Maybe financial struggle was not openly discussed, only sensed through tension secrecy or sudden sacrifice. Children are extraordinarily perceptive. They may not understand numbers, but they understand atmosphere. And atmosphere becomes memory. Memory becomes expectation. Expectation becomes behavior. A child who grows up around financial unpredictability may learn that visible signs matter. Looking okay can become part of staying okay. Dressing well, keeping up appearances, not letting outsiders know there is strain. These are not superficial lessons in that context. They are adaptations to emotional conditions. They teach the nervous system that dignity is fragile and must be defended, that vulnerability invites exposure, that the safest way to survive instability is to conceal it. Later in life, that adaptation can remain active even when circumstances change. You may no longer be in the same environment. You may have more autonomy, more income, more choices. But the emotional template persists. Part of you may still believe that if your limitations become visible, something terrible will follow: rejection, loss of respect, humiliation, abandonment. So you protect yourself the only way your system knows how. You make instability less visible, not because you are careless, because you are conditioned. This is why shame is often woven so tightly into financial image management. Shame is not just the feeling that you made a mistake. It is the feeling that the mistake says something unbearable about who you are. When money becomes fused with identity, financial strain can stop feeling like a circumstance and start feeling like a character flaw. Then, the pressure to appear secure intensifies because the image is no longer covering a practical difficulty. It is covering a threatened sense of self, and when the self feels threatened, people do not behave calmly. They behave protectively. That may mean spending beyond comfort to preserve social parity. It may mean refusing to downsize a lifestyle because the symbolic loss feels too great. It may mean overcommitting, overgiving, overappearing competent. Not because these choices are financially logical, but because they soothe a deeper fear. If the image cracks, what will that reveal? For many, the answer is not that I have less money. It is that I am less worthy. This is where early family conditioning becomes especially powerful. In some households, money was tied to morality. People who had it were respected. People who lost it were judged. In others, money and love became emotionally entangled achievement, brought approval, visible success, reduced conflict appearances, protected family pride. Some children learned that being low maintenance was virtuous, but being visibly needy was dangerous. Others learned that external polish mattered more than internal reality. Keep the house nice, dress well, smile, don't let people know. These are not just family preferences. They are emotional instructions. And emotional instructions often outlive the context that created them. You can see this in adulthood when people feel disproportionate distress at very ordinary forms of financial honesty. Saying that's out of my budget can feel far more exposing than it objectively is. Admitting that you need to pause, cut back, or step away from a lifestyle can feel almost like social death. The body reacts not as if a preference has been stated, but as if status, connection, or dignity are under threat. This is not overreaction. It is the residue of conditioning. Loss aversion also helps explain the intensity. In behavioral psychology, losses usually feel more painful than equivalent gains feel satisfying. But with money image, the perceived loss is often not just financial. It is symbolic, a loss of status, a loss of identity, a loss of the story you hoped others would believe about your life. And symbolic losses can feel enormous because they destabilize how you organize meaning. Money, for many people, is not experienced merely as currency. It is experienced as proof that you are progressing, proof that your decisions make sense, proof that you are not falling behind, proof that your life is coherent and defensible. So, when you spend to maintain the image of financial security, you may be trying to preserve that proof, to keep alive a version of yourself that feels socially legible, someone who belongs in the room, someone who is doing well enough, someone who cannot be pitied. But this performance carries emotional side effects. It can make relationships feel less intimate, because intimacy requires truth. It can make rest difficult, because image maintenance does not turn off easily. It can distort self-perception, because you begin to confuse how stable you look with how stable you feel. And perhaps most painfully, it can leave you feeling unseen even when others admire you, because they are admiring a surface you worked very hard to construct. There is loneliness in that. Not dramatic loneliness, quiet loneliness. The kind that comes from being praised for a version of yourself that is partly defensive. And then there is the wider culture surrounding all of this, because individual psychology does not unfold in isolation. It is constantly shaped by social cues, economic pressure, and the visual language of status. Modern consumer culture is extraordinarily skilled at turning insecurity into aspiration. It teaches you that competence should be visible, that success should look a certain way, that adulthood should be aesthetically convincing. Social media intensifies this by collapsing private life into display. The old pressure to keep up with neighbors has become the pressure to keep up with hundreds of curated realities at once. You are not just comparing income, you are comparing atmospheres. Someone else's calm kitchen, tailored clothes, soft lighting holiday photos, polished routine. Even when you intellectually know these images are selective, your nervous system still absorbs them as information about what stability is supposed to look like. This shapes desire in subtle ways. You do not just want the thing. You want the feeling the thing appears to represent: ease, order, adulthood, legitimacy. That is the real seduction, not luxury itself, but emotional symbolism. Trying to look financially secure often means trying to look untroubled, as though your life is under control, your future is manageable, your identity is intact. But images cannot regulate a nervous system for long. They can only distract from what remains unresolved. And when you begin to understand that something important shifts, you stop asking only "why did I make that choice?" and begin asking a more compassionate question: what did that choice help me avoid feeling? Often the answer is revealing: exposure, inferiority, grief, fear, shame, the ache of not being where you thought you would be, the old terror of instability returning, the dread that if your limitations become visible, so will your wounds. Seen this way, the behavior becomes more understandable. Not admirable, not shameful, understandable. And understanding changes the emotional atmosphere, because when you see that the performance was never only about impressing people, you can begin to notice the deeper function it served. It may have helped you preserve dignity in environments where dignity felt fragile. It may have helped you belong in spaces where exclusion felt close. It may have helped you hold yourself together when the alternative felt too exposing. That does not make the cost disappear, but it does soften the shame. And that matters, because shame keeps people trapped in repetition. Awareness creates space. Space to notice the moment before the performance begins. Space to recognize that the urge is not always about desire, but about defense. Space to see that the object, the appearance, the polished signal was often standing in for something much older and more human, the need to feel safe, intact, and acceptable. The truth is, looking financially secure and feeling financially safe are not the same experience. One is visual, the other is internal. One depends on being interpreted correctly by other people. The other depends on what your nervous system believes, and those two things can live very far apart. So, if you recognize yourself in this pattern, the point is not to condemn it. It is to understand the burden of carrying an image that was never meant to hold your whole emotional life, because eventually appearances become too small for the weight they are asked to carry. A bag, a car, a meal, a polished online identity. None of these can reliably contain fear, shame, longing, or the need for belonging. They can only symbolize what is missing. And symbols, however powerful, are not substitutes for safety. Sometimes the deepest shift begins there. not in changing what the world sees first, but in noticing what the performance has been trying to protect all along.